again, don't worry about if you don't remember all the words. Just allow yourself to let your brain make some connections. Even if you can't, like, oh, that's the thing connected to the thing that does the other thing, right? I mean, this is over 50 language, right? You know, just let your brain do that, because you can always go back and look up the information. But just see what you notice. This is a picture of my neighborhood. I think it's important that, I thought it was important that I had the picture in here, because this is the time that we're living in. Different people who have different sets of experiences, both as individuals and in their families and across generations, will see this picture and have a different response. So the ACEs, and my guess is that most people at this point know what ACE stands for. So Adverse Childhood Events or Experiences. And the original ACEs studies took place in 1995 to 1997 in California, between the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. They had over 17,000 adults in Southern California. And they looked at these 10 categories of adverse childhood experiences. And they looked at, you know, and they were looking at medical records, right? They looked at what were some of the outcomes if you had how many numbers of these adverse experiences. And so there's 3 types of abuse: physical, emotional, or sexual; 2 types of neglect, physical or emotional; and then what they call household dysfunction, which is mental illness, relative incarcerated, substance abuse, a mother who was treated violently, or divorce. And so what they found in those original studies of over 17,000 adults is all these areas of impact, the greater the number of ACEs, so the higher your ACE score, and you can get a 0 to 10 for an ACE score. So the higher your ACE score, the more likely it is that you would have some of these behavioral, physical, or mental health difficulties. And so things like cancer and stroke, COPD, broken bones, increased dangerous behaviors or high-risk behaviors like smoking, alcoholism, and drug use. So it was pretty clear that these types of experiences were coming up with these kinds of outcomes. The most recent large-scale study in 2010 was in 2010 at the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey, and it's called the BRIEFs. And that happens, it happens every few years in different sets of states, but it was in 10 states plus Washington, D.C., and there was over 53,000 adults in those studies. And so these studies have continued to go on. What's interesting to me is that the original ACEs studies were 25 years ago. And we're still, hardly anybody really knows the information about them. And so what is that about? Well, partially what that's about is that by the time the research is done and then it's published, and then people start learning about it, and then it gets into the ways that we teach people in graduate school, and then from graduate school it gets into the way that we understand who people are. And so partially it's that, but 25 years? That's a little excessive. So if you look at the CDC website, I just basically reproduced this pyramid from the CDC website. And so at birth, so we're born, and there's adverse childhood experiences. So one of those 10 categories of things could happen. When those things happen, it's very likely that there will be disrupted neurodevelopment, like we just talked about, right? Because of the disrupted neurodevelopment, there's social, emotional, and cognitive impairments. It doesn't necessarily mean you have a learning disability or you're not smart or those kinds of things, but that there's difficulties because of the amounts of distress. Adoption of high-risk behaviors. So drinking, you know, like when extreme sports, you know, those kinds of things, self-harm, disease, disability, and social problems. Very high likelihood, the more adverse childhood experiences you have, the higher the incidence of disease, disability, and social or relational issues. And then finally, early death. And so people with 3 or more ACEs are, have a 20-year lower life expectancy than people with less than 3 ACEs. 20 years. And so, you know, smart people studying this stuff, and they said, well, maybe that's because of high-risk behaviors, right? And so what they did is they took the data set and they said, we're going to get rid of all the high-risk behaviors. We're just going to take out all the people who have high-risk behaviors, smoking, drinking, you know, that kind of stuff. And guess what they found? Still the same. Regardless of high-risk behaviors, people who have 3 or more ACEs have a 20-year shorter life expectancy. And if you are a member of certain racial or ethnic groups, then you have an even shorter life expectancy. So in the most recent briefs in Minnesota, so this information is from a 2013 Minnesota Department of Health publication, and it's in the public domain. It's easy to find. And so the Minnesota briefs, what they looked at was the prevalence of ACEs in adults in Minnesota. What they did, which I thought was kind of dumb actually, is that they removed neglect from the categories that they were looking at. I don't know why they did that. Other states did that also, and some states did not do it. And so the CDC had asked all these 10 states, will you put in these ACEs questions in your surveys that you're doing this time? And so this is what happened. What we found was that, you know, in Minnesota, 7% of adults in Minnesota, out of these 13,000 Minnesota adults, 7% had an incarcerated household member growing up. And then you can see where it goes down there to the end of emotional abuse. 28% of respondents said that they grew up with emotional abuse. So, and the distribution of ACE is that 40% of the people who responded endorsed having 1 ACE, 22% endorsed having 2 ACEs, and 15% endorsed having 3 ACEs. And so 60% of the Minnesota population has 3 or less ACEs, which means that 24% of the Minnesota population has 4 or 5 ACEs, 4 or more ACEs, actually. If we look a little bit at chronic mental health, here you can see that as number of ACEs increase, likelihood of depression and anxiety increases. So for those who have 5 or more ACEs, you have 36% likelihood of lifetime depression, lifetime incidence of depression. And so in some ways we say, oh, depression, anxiety, that makes sense, right? If you have bad things happen to you, you're probably more depressed and anxious. Well, the interesting thing is that it's not only true for that, it's also true for asthma, obesity, chronic drinking, having poor health in general, and early death. And so some of why we kind of think about this and wonder about this is like, what is the impact of chronic stress on the body, right? So chronic stress hormones, cortisol is a stress hormone. Cortisol, taken outside the body, is corrosive to metal, right? And so high levels of cortisol over time is impacting all the systems, all the hormonal systems in the body, including the immune system. Many people who have 4 or more ACEs have chronic inflammation. And that chronic inflammation is what, and immune system deficiencies is what drives things like chronic fatigue syndrome. And other things that we have no medical answers for, right? And so systemic inflammation and chronic early childhood abuse actually, what's the term? Like rheumatoid arthritis, autoimmune diseases, thank you. Many autoimmune diseases are higher in people who have 4 or more ACEs. Because the immune system is greatly impacted by stress hormones. And we know if you're under a lot of stress, you're more likely to catch the flu, right? Because our immune response is lower. And so when I work with people, and a lot of times it's women who come in, they've got chronic fatigue or lupus or other things like that, and they come in and they're like, I've been to the doctor a million times, I have chronic pain. That's the other thing about chronic inflammation is you have chronic pain. And the doctor says that it's not connected to anything, meaning it's all in your head, right? Well, here's an interesting fact. Emotional pain and physical pain are processed in the same area of the brain. So they're essentially, to your brain, they're the same thing. And people are actually feeling pain in their bodies, whether you think it has a cause or not. And so what I've started saying to people is you go back to your doctor and you say, this actually does have a cause. And the cause is chronic childhood abuse and having 4 or more ACEs. That is the cause of not all autoimmune disorders, and not autoimmune disorders for every single person, but for many people, that kind of chronic pain and chronic inflammation is a result of that. I'm going to do a quick run through here of what is the stress danger response system. And now most of us probably have heard about like the fight or flight system, right? So something dangerous happens and we have a fight flight response. So this little guy here on the beach, you know, he's kind of laying there, he's in the sand and the waves are coming, but you know, for him, I mean, yeah, for maybe his mom, she's like, danger, right? But this little guy is like, no problem, safety. And so what's happening there then is he's in the optimal arousal zone, right? And so he's seeing those waves come in and there's potentially some danger, but you know, he's just kind of kicking back and top of his brain's looking around and going, you know, I'm okay. Nothing bad's going to happen to me. Probably has some good enough parenting going on behind that, right? And so the parasympathetic or the rest and digest system is turned on. And when the rest and digest system is turned on, our social engagement systems are turned on. And so the more attunement, early attunement there is, and the more you build distress tolerance neurology, and the more you can manage your big feelings, like we call them in my family, and the more you can stay in relationship with people, it builds on itself, right? So what happens then, and this is just our normal system, we get information from outside ourselves and inside ourselves, and the limbic and vagal systems turn on. And in this situation, it's like, ooh, this is a beach with some danger, right? This does not look like a safety beach. And so what happens is we kick into the hyperarousal system. And so our brain, you know, so the amygdala flashes danger, right? And then, you know, we pop up to the top of the brain, and at the top of the brain, we go, yeah, it's a little dangerous out here, right? And so then we pop down to the bottom of the brain, and the bottom of the brain says, I got to look around and shuffle through all these memories and find out if there's something else that's happened to us that'll tell us what to do right now, right? And then you pop up to the top of the brain and you go, okay, is one of those things going to work? You know, I better run, or maybe I can fight, or maybe freezing is the best thing to do for now, right? And so fight, flight, or freeze. You know, we get pupil dilation, we mobilize, and we're ready for action. All our sensory systems are right on, okay? Because if it's dangerous, we need to take in more sensory information so that we have more information to decide from the top of our brains what to do next. When people have dissociation, rather than having a fight-flight response, they have a rage-panic response. And so what happens is a loop in the bottom of the brain. There's this dangerous thing, and this dangerous thing, and that dangerous thing, and that dangerous thing. No information from the top of the brain, right? Because this bridge here is very thin. And so all the only information they have on which to make a decision is down here with all the dangerous memories, all the dangerous stuff. Because when you think about something dangerous, our brains will think about other dangerous things. You know, if we think about pleasant things, our brains will think about other pleasant things.
So you said rage and?
Rage or panic.
Rage and panic.
Yeah. And so flight turns into panic, right? And anger, which is an emotion we need, turns into rage. All rage is dissociative. Because rage is not ever just about what's happening in the room. And so you can be very angry and very clear and making good decisions and communicating, right? But when you're rageful, in fact, a lot of times I work with people who are aggressive or they're offenders and they go into rages and they say, I really don't remember what I did. I say, I believe you. Because it was dissociated. So they have blackouts. They're just gone. And so that's a real thing. And it's not something people are doing on purpose. The thing that most people haven't heard about is what we call the life threat system. And so this information here, what's going on in this situation, is really life-threatening. It's beyond dangerous. And now we're talking about life threat. And so what happens in our brain then is that the information comes from our vagal system in through here and through the limbic system. And it says, goes to the top of the brain. Yep, it's really dangerous out here. To the bottom of the brain. We got to do something. Nope, don't have anything else that'll tell us what to do here. Goes up to the top of the brain. I'm drowning. What's going on, right? Life threat. And so we get hyper aroused. And then what happens when it's actually a life threat and death is imminent? This is where the dissociative systems kick in. And we go from hyperarousal to hypoarousal. Our pupils constrict, our lungs slow down, our heart rate slows down, our blood flow slows down. It is the immobilization freeze response. So it's not an activated freeze, right? You know, so rabbits are in activated freeze, right? Because they're just munching along, doing their little thing, and then a hawk comes in, right? They see the hawk shadow, and they freeze. But as soon as the shadow passes, they're gone, right? So they're in an activated freeze. As the hawk stoops, and they see the shadow coming closer, that's when they go into the life threat response. And what happens is, if you're about to be torn from limb to limb, it really helps for you to be less aware that it's happening. And so the timekeeper of the brain goes offline, all the sensory systems shut down, your brain shoots endogenous opiates throughout your body. And so you're gonna die, but it won't feel as bad, right? So that is then the life threat system. And folks that I work with who have chronic early childhood trauma are in a life threat response a lot of the time. Because when they were young, it was life threatening a lot of the time. And so, so does all that make sense with the brain stuff and everything? Okay. So if we look at ACEs by race in Minnesota, what we can find, you see there, is that 19% of African Americans, and this was as of 2013, have 5 or more ACEs. 23% of Native American, American Indians in Minnesota have 5 or more ACEs. As you know, if we look at white people in Minnesota, 7% have 5 or more ACEs. If you look at the Minnesota School student survey data, oops, what you can see is that here's this 2016, 4% of students report having 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. If we break that down into where does that come from, we can see that American Indian students in 8th, 9th, and 11th grade, how much, what is that? 10% have 4 or more ACEs. And so as we're looking at these things and how they go along with race and ethnicity, another piece that has to come in is poverty. And if you look to the right here at people who rent and have never owned are 2.7 times more likely to have 5 or more ACEs than people who've owned their home. People who own their homes but are always worried about the mortgage are 4 times more likely to have 5 or more ACEs than those who don't always worry about their mortgage. People who are always worried about buying food are 5.6 times more likely than those who don't always worry about buying food or having 5 or more ACEs. And so I think it's really important that we start to think about and talk about how is poverty itself impacting the occurrence of ACEs, poverty and stress. So what we've talked about so far is personal experiences of violence and family violence, right? So these are our 10 ACEs that we've been talking about, or 8 if you look at the Minnesota briefs. So these are the original ACEs, the 10 ACEs, and the Kaiser study is on the right there. And in Philadelphia, in 2013, in 1998, they started looking at information. And in 2013, in the Philadelphia ACE study, they said, well, we have a really different population and different numbers for different ones of these ACEs. And so if you look at what's the difference between the population in Southern California and population in Philadelphia, much more income stratified population, a much more diverse sample. It's not 70% white. That was the original Kaiser ACE, and it's not a bad thing. It's just the population they had. It's just that we need more information, right? And so if you look at what the Philadelphia folks did is they expanded the concept of adversity to include witnessing violence, feeling discrimination, having adverse neighborhood experiences, which really correspond to living in poverty, living in an impoverished area or in a violent neighborhood, being bullied, or living in foster care. And what they found was that these 5 ACEs could be replaced for other ACEs, and there was similar levels of adverse effects in adulthood. And so, whereas the original ACEs, were looking primarily at family violence and personal experiences of violence, the Philadelphia expanded ACEs are looking a lot more at cultural and societal systems of oppression. And so what are the systems in which we live that, that impact the ways that people's systems are negatively impacted? And so this is where we start talking about health disparities in communities of color. Epigenetics, we had a question. What does epigenetics mean? Well, epigenetics is kind of a newer term, and epi means above, right? And so epigenetics means basically above genetics. And so our genetic code is a blueprint, and it doesn't really do anything, and it very rarely changes. Epigenetics is the information that's above the genes that says which genes should be read, right? So am I doing this recipe with sugar or maple syrup, right? Like, which genes get read and in what order? And so epigenetics, so while our genetic code changes very slowly over long periods of time, and genetics applies to a whole group of people, epigenetics can change from generation to generation. Because the stress that I feel, the stress that I'm going through impacts everything in my body. And one of the things that's in my body, pretty useless at this point, is eggs, right? And so when I'm born, I have all the eggs I'm ever going to have. And so the stress over my lifetime is impacting those eggs amongst everything else in my body. And so what we know is that we've done a number of studies about Holocaust survivors. And what we know is that the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors with no intervening traumatic experiences are more likely to have symptoms of PTSD. And so a lower ability to regulate their responsiveness. They have more anxiety, more depression. All those things are true. And it's because their grandparents were in concentration camps. And so how could that possibly be true? Well, think about it this way. This always gives me goosebumps. But so my grandmother, my Polish grandmother, who, was an adult during the Depression, came from Poland in the early 1900s, and grew up with family violence. And she had all the eggs she was ever going to have. One of those eggs was half the genetic code with epigenetic coding that became my mom. And when my grandma was pregnant with my mom developed all the eggs she was ever going to have, one of which became half of my genetic and epigenetic markers, right? And so I was, in a sense, part of my genetic code, what went into, not the whole thing, but partially what went into making me who I am in terms of my ability to respond to stress and some other ways of responding in the world, was influenced by my grandmother's living in domestic violence with my grandfather, who was an alcoholic, and also growing up in a family with a dad who was in Poland, had a lot of money, and here they lived in poverty, right? It's a pretty common story for a lot of immigrants around that time, for a lot of immigrants today. People who have are physicians in other countries, and they come here and they're janitors, right? There's a lot of stress to that. And so it's the way that chronic stress in one generation impacts the whole biology, part of which is eggs and sperm, which then carries the genetic coding for the next generation and the generation after that. Historical trauma. Most people have heard of the concept of historical trauma, and I just want to talk about it really briefly, so that you start to get the idea of just talking about the grandparent thing, right? So you see these slides over here, and these slides are, I believe they're Birkenau, and so this is concentration camp in Germany, right? Over here, these pictures look pretty familiar and pretty similar, don't they? Well, this is the west coast of the United States at the same period of time as the Japanese internment. I have friends who are my age whose parents as children were interred in Japanese internment camps. And they were the second generation of Japanese Americans in their family. They lost all their money, all their belongings, their homes, their jobs. They went into these, what we call internment camps. They were forced labor camps. And so many people got very sick. Many people never recovered because of the close quarters and disease and all those kinds of things. And so an enormous impact. These are traumas. A historical trauma is something that happens to a whole group of people in a period of time that then has an impact throughout time. You can see here, we don't much think about, I think we don't much think about what slavery was actually like, because it's a term that we actually, oh, I'm a slave to this or to that or those kinds of things. And we don't really actually think about the experience of what it was like. And so this is a picture of someone who's been whipped repeatedly and the scars across the back. It wasn't that long ago. It wasn't actually that long ago. And this here is a picture of when the Chinese built the railroads across Canada. And so just like a lot of other places in the world, the United States infrastructure was built by people who were owned by other people. And the people who own those people are still people who run our government. Because like many other things, the kinds of work that people do passes down in families. Of course it does. I'm a teacher. Both my parents were Chicago public school teachers. My sister's a Chicago public school teacher. We've got people who are nurses and pastors and, all kinds of things. And so that makes sense because partially I think it's genetic, and partially it's what we get nurtured to do more of. And partially it's what's around us, right? And so these things are still going on in our communities, right? And if we look up here, these two pictures, I think you can just take a look at the clothing and you can tell that these are pictures that were taken in the late 50s and early 60s. This picture down here, struck me as being so similar when I saw it a couple years ago in the paper. So similar to the pictures that I remember when I was a kid. I was born in 1962 in Chicago. That weird class of people who are pretty Catholic and also Union, and so the Democratic Union Catholic, wait a minute, how does that all go together, right? But we figured it out, or we didn't. But what I want you to see here is who are the people that have the power and who are the people that are in positions of being dominated. And when you look at these pictures, I have my own response. What I see in the three Black women in these pictures is a profound sense of dignity and a profound sense of knowing who they are, no matter what the people in front of them are telling them about who they are. And I believe that there's a piece of that for many African-American people that has to do with the Black church. And so there's family violence, personal experiences of violence, historical trauma, cultural and societal systems of oppression. I'm just going to say a couple of things about this, that the 13th Amendment wasn't that long ago. The mid-1860s, right? Some of us had great-grandparents when we were young. right? My grandmother was born in, I think, 1902, right? So her parents were born around this time. That's how close slavery is to us. That's how close it is. And so we live in a system that we change something and then it quickly changes back to the way that it was. And it's what we're seeing again right now. I'm not going to talk a lot about that. I don't think I'm going to talk so much about this either. Put this up. Whoops. Just looking at policing in Minneapolis, and Minneapolis is actually one of the better places in the country. But 33 months starting from 2012 to 2014. And if we just take a look at, just visually, the annual, average annual low-level arrests by race between 2012 and 2014, Black people are 28% of the Black population were arrested for low-level arrests. Native American, 27% of the Native American population, about 3% of the white population. And low-level arrests are things like loitering, littering, taillight out. How many people have ever had taillight out and are white and have gotten pulled over and arrested for it?
Not arrested, but.
Not arrested, but yeah, you get pulled over. It's like, yeah, you know, you got a taillight out there, and you know, you might get a ticket, but arrested, right? And so the one thing that's kind of interesting is, and I don't know that it's on the books anymore. It probably shouldn't be, but it could be, that there was a crime in this study between 2012 and 2014 in Minneapolis called the crime of it doesn't fit any crime. So essentially, I don't like the way you look, so I'm arresting you.
What?
72% of the people arrested for the crime that doesn't fit any crime were Black in Minneapolis between the years of 2012 and 2014. And if we remember, 2014 was the year of Ferguson. This is a picture that's currently in my neighborhood. This is Chicago Avenue, right up near 38th Street, and it's names of individuals since 2014 that are Black that have been shot and killed by police officers.
Explain that it leads up to the.
Oh yeah, Brent just said it leads up to the place where George Floyd was murdered. This was at one of the protests that I was at, and a poem written by a neighbor of mine who's from Trinidad, could we please give the police department to the grandmothers? Right? Because what we know is that when you make decisions from an ethic of care, different types of things happen to people. All right. Yeah. So ongoing microaggressions, and I'm sure that people have heard these things. You know, and you've got them on your thing here, and we can break them into micro insults, micro assaults, and micro invalidations. But, you know, being continuously asked the question, know where are you really from? Right? Which is an invalidation of who a person is. Or you speak really good English. And I have a friend who's second generation Vietnamese. And people say, where are you from? And she says, Nebraska. And they say, no, where are you really from? And she says, Nebraska. And they say, you speak really good English. And she says, thank you. So do you. Right? But this kind of like ongoing, I don't see you. I see something else that I have in my brain that should be you. All right, I'm going to skip this adolescent report. And I'm going to go, oh no, I guess I am going to do this. All right, I'm going to do this quickly. Now, what I want you to see is that this is the percentage of who feel nervous, worried, upset all of the time or most of the time during the last 30 days for 6th, 9th, and 12th graders. And they broke it up by race here. See, blue is African American, American Indian, Asian, Hispanic, and white. And what I want to show you here is if we break this up a different way, that the difference in the percentages between the racial categories, if you can see here, largely has to do with whether or not the respondent was male or female. And so it's girls who make up the large percentage in every ethnic and racial group of people who are worried, nervous, worried, upset all or most of the time during the last 30 days. This is from our Minnesota Student Survey data. And the reason I wanted to show it this way is because systems of oppression and social location, where you happen to be at the time, and cultural identities interact in an intersectional way. And so it's not, intersectionality isn't just how do I identify and what are all my cultures. It's an interaction between my cultural identities, where I'm standing right now, and what are the systems of oppression that are at play. And so here what we have then is, again, our ACEs pyramid from the CDC, and what I put underneath it is history, historical trauma, epigenetics, embodiment, cultural and societal systems of oppression. And then we see why we have even a greater impact of adverse childhood events because of ongoing microaggressions, implicit bias, community and personal experiences of violence, poverty, and war. And this is what then, if we go back to our brain, and we remember that the fear, stress, danger brain, right, is in this center part of the brain, amygdala. We have to respond to danger. This part of the brain has to be on. And the more this part of the brain is on, the less the social engagement centers of the brain are on. And so it puts people at an enormous advantage in almost every way. We're going to get into this next during the next little session here coming up in an hour, about an hour. But we learn, grow, and develop best in the context of caring, compassionate relationships. You know, all you gotta do is go back to babies, right? Our brains are designed to grow best in the context of caring, compassionate relationship. Because when we have love and care, all the parts of our brain that are processing information, that are thinking about things, that are learning things, that are connecting things, that basically don't have to worry about getting fed because they know pretty much you're going to do it eventually, right? Even if you're not doing it right now, right? All those things. And that is our window of optimal development, right? So anything less than caring, compassionate environment, relationship, reduces our capacity to learn and grow and develop. So I'm going to stop sharing that. And what we have planned right now is small group conversation. And Janine has already broken people into small groups who are by yourself in your own little box. I know you're not really in a little box, but and so what'll happen is that you'll get a notice that says join breakout room. And then you will actually leave this space and end up in another space with a smaller group of people. And that group of people are going to be part of your discussion group for the whole time, for the whole weekend. And so, yeah, so that's what we're going to do next. And you have handouts. But what I would ask you to do is to create space for yourself to step into whatever place, in terms of the conversation, whatever place you feel like you can both feel care and comfort and step a little to your edge. Not over the edge, you know, just a little to your edge. I, for one, have entered into this weekend trusting the good will of the people who are part of this conference, and I think that that's most of your experience with this conference over the years also. So, okay. If somebody wants me to pop into your group, there's a button that you can press that says, I want you to pop into my group, and I will do that.